At this point, Lee Hun-wook had done everything that he could when it came to dealing with those corrupt jerks from the guild. All that was left now was to save those children and these people. Meanwhile, the red-hooded monsters were barking and snarling at their forced guests, intimidating and scaring them. Until the hero was able to get to them, he hoped that the girls would be able to stand their ground and stay safe. Well, they had no time to waste, so it was time to begin the civilian rescue plan. There was a sudden thud on the ground just as he said that, and out of nowhere, something had fallen from the sky. The blue-haired hero stared in surprise and sort of squinted his eyes to see that the red-hooded demons had appeared right on time. The monsters had landed right beside him, and he flopped over to make it easier. Hyun-wook had already held his breath to make sure that the sleeping gas would not knock him out, so he was just pretending at this point. The guild members watched and asked their leader if it was really okay to just let these soldier newcomers do as they liked. If they let them sniff around, then surely they would find out that the guild was connected to the Black Magic Association, which would be really bad for them. The men had said that they cleared out the first cause of erosion, so it seemed a good idea to just take care of the soldiers while they did not suspect a thing. The leader considered their options as he watched the cross-dressing sergeant get picked up, but the hooded demons seemed to realize something, and they paused. The leader scolded the man giving the terrible advice, asking the idiot if he really thought that was possible. It was clear that the unit that they were facing now had a separate main unit, and if they acted carelessly, they would not be the only ones to suffer. Their ugly team leader, Chu Koyong, was sure to end up in trouble too, and they could not let that happen. The red-hooded figures were throwing up from disgust at how ugly the steel bender was. That was so rude. It actually looked like they would rather leave him on the ground than take him with them. Beggars could not be choosers, they needed every sacrifice that they could get. So, grudgingly they tossed him over their shoulder, though they really looked like they would rather dump him in the trash. Anyway, the guild members guessed that the guy exposing the Black Magic Association on his own would not change anything. On top of that, if he got carried to their base, then they had even less to worry about. See, the wicked guild leader was sure that it was impossible to use any abilities in that place. That was why it was called the player's hell. The wicked man grinned and said that once the rescue operation properly began, they would strike down the rear. That was the most natural way for a player to die during an operation after all. Well, the red-hooded figures finally made it to their dark and evil base, and the hooded zombie was more than happy to just toss our dude on the ground like he was garbage. So rude. The man cracked his eye open, wondering where he was, and he realized that he had been locked in some kind of prison. The man had actually dozed off a bit because of the toxic fumes, and he had not expected them to restrain him with mana restraints. That was so annoying, and he wondered when they had the time to take his inventory bag, too. Now his thigh was left bare, and he was with even fewer options than when he started. Hyun-wook then realized that this awful place was surely the infamous Seoul Detention Center, where criminal players often got imprisoned. It was one of the many worst-case scenarios, and even the soldiers were horrified when they followed their leader right to the Seoul Detention Center. It was going to be really hard to fight a proper battle in that kind of place, and they realized that if their beloved sergeant had mana restraints on him too, then surely this was a very difficult and hopeless situation. The Seoul Detention Center was surrounded by a barrier that was just above A rank. As long as it was not released from within, they would not be able to go in and assist either. The team communicated what they had discovered to each other, but the sniper team got into position anyway. They were not quite sure if it was wise to continue the mission as things were, but it was Lee Hun-wook's operation, and they trusted the man with their life. Their sergeant was always somehow a few steps ahead, so they were sure that this was somehow within expectations for him. No matter what, their leader was sure to have a plan to overcome these obstacles, so everyone was told to hold their positions. Meanwhile, inside the cell, the hero definitely did not have a plan, and he realized that maybe he had not thought this plan through. He was in a very terrible situation right now, especially with the mana cuffs on his hands. While the sergeant was trying to think of a plan, he heard the sounds of a voice complaining about how they had to clean up after those guys. A man walked in and was shocked to see a hooded figure sitting casually by the wall. The man in blue clothes yelled at the hooded guy for staying in that same position all day long, and he wanted to tell the man to move. However, someone warned the angry dude that it was best to leave the hooded guy be. The Black Magic Association had picked him up, and there was no need to cause any pointless trouble. Still, the man in blue clothes pouted and asked if it was really okay to believe those Black Magic Association guys. They had said that they would fake all of their deaths and give them new identities, but there was no way that such a thing would be easy. The goons sure hoped that the cult that was shamelessly sacrificing young girls would not one day stab them in the back. Talk about delusional. At any rate, They were somehow sure that they would not let the association get away with betraying them, especially since they had no restraints anyway. Then they entered the cell where they kept the little girls. Grinning with a wicked, malicious glint in their eyes, the angry goon said that they should just get this over with. One by one, each of the little girls was grabbed, and they screamed, struggling in their captor's hands as they begged for someone to save them. The girls were quickly knocked out by the angry, heartless man, who scoffed like they were just a nuisance when they begged for their lives. It turns out that these goons did not even know what the monsters were using the human sacrifices for. They were really colossal idiots. One of the idiots scolded his angry colleague, saying that he had told him not to cause the girls pointless pain. Besides, they did not have time to wonder about stuff that they did not understand. They had to just keep moving. The angry man, of course, reacted, yelling at the other guy for acting like he was his boss of him. The other guy grinned in successful rage bait, saying the angry fellow was so easy to see right through. He even mocked him for all of the stuff that he was so fond of saying. It seemed that they were going to start a pointless fight in the jail, and the guy with paler hair rushed up at the angry fellow, asking if he wanted to fight. His leg was lit up in odd bright red patterns, and the angry man seemed to rethink his anger. The man with the pale hair would do whatever it took to get out of that jail, because there was someone that he really wanted to kill out there. If anyone got in his way, then Pale Hair was determined to tear them apart, and he wanted everyone to keep that in mind. This pale-haired guy was called Lee Wunchel, and he was a C-rank player, with the trait of a fighter, and he just so happened to be the hero's school bully. That was not going to end well. The angry guy huffed and said that it was nothing like that at all. Anyway, they grabbed the girls and were about to start leaving with the sacrifices. They stalked out of the jail. But then Lee Wunchel paused and glanced at the cell that had a suspiciously silent girl. He walked past without asking any questions. Lee Hanwook was horrified to see the girls being grabbed from the cells, and he knew that he had to move quickly or those girls would die. He considered that perhaps he could use just a little bit of mana through the mana restraints. The man struggled, begging the gods of mana to free up his hands. He just needed a little. However, it just was not working. Suddenly, the pale-haired guy returned to laugh and mock at the ugly girl struggling in her cell. He laughed that the stupid zombies had picked up something weird again. So suddenly, the fake hair fell right off, and Wunchel stared in absolute shock and disgust to see a face that he could never forget. Yes, it was none other than the demonic and very familiar face of Lee Hanwook, who waved and greeted Wunchel, saying that it had been a while. The pale-haired man immediately lost it, yelling and cursing at the hero who dared show his face before him. The hero clearly wanted to die so badly that he came all that way. Within seconds, the angry goon had kicked down the ugly girl, and there was a huge explosion within the building, so loud that it could be heard from the outside. Never underestimate the power of rage baiting because it works wonders. The soldiers outside were panicking, and they called to their lieutenant and asked for a sniper team report. The snipers zoomed in on the sudden energy blast and the hole that it had created. They could not get an accurate read on the situation because of the smoke, and the barrier was still rather active. The snipers kept monitoring the situation, unaware of the evil guild members who were sneaking up behind them with wicked intent. They had their faces set with the force of wickedness moving within them. Meanwhile, the soldiers were still focused on their mission, and the orange-haired dude asked Minta to pick up the shield and move forward. The barrier was still intact, so no matter how they looked at it, it was not a signal from Sergeant Lee Hanwook. They could not afford to miss the signal, because if they did, all their plans would be for nothing. They also could not afford to move too early. Still, there was nothing that they could currently do about the barrier, and they wondered if they could get past with the warping ability that Orange Hair had. It was an emergency, so the dude was ready to do whatever they could do. They could not just stand around and do nothing. So, he radioed the rest of the soldiers, telling them all to listen and to pay close attention. The moment they passed the barrier with warp, they had no clue what would happen inside, so everyone was to keep their guard up. Even though they were in an assault operation, they were really screaming their heads off and making a mess of things. It was rather pathetic, and the leader of the guild grinned, thinking that for sure there was no way that these guys were able to take down the first cause of erosion. The moment those guys proceeded with their plan, they would betray them and strike their rear. Meanwhile, inside the jail, our hero was lying on the floor like a damsel in distress. The bully laughed, saying that he had prayed every night for a moment like this, showing that his nights were not very busy. Wunchel had hoped and dreamed for a chance to kill Hyunwook and tear him to shreds. The man cheered that his prayers had come true, and even better, the hero had arrived with manacles on. There was no way that guy could escape, and the bully could not just wait out his sudden dopamine rush. The sergeant groaned that Wunchel was much like a brat who never listened, and that was why his leg had ended up that way. That was definitely a sore conversation topic, as the blonde bully exploded in rage at that comment and accused the hero of being the one who had done that to him. The hero grinned wider as his power of rage bait was working even better than he expected. The blonde came charging at him with a lightning kick, and the hero raised his hands, stretching them out so that the kick would hit right where the cuffs connected. However, just as he was about to make contact, the bully froze. It seemed the man was not the idiot that the hero would have liked him to be. The man laughed that he would not fall for the hero's provocation or break those mana restraints for him. He slammed his foot instead into the protagonist's belly, and Heinwook had to admit that Wunschel was really not a complete idiot after all. The blue-haired hero slid right out of the jail that the blonde broke and began to race away, so Wunschel called out to the silent hooded figure and told him to grab the escaping pervert. The hooded figure's eyes glinted a malicious red as he heard the command, and suddenly the strange man was on his feet. The hero gasped to see the size of that guy, and the pale-haired bully rushed forward with joy as the big guy raised his hand. The bully laughed, calling the hero a dead tin can, and laughing that there was nowhere to run. He laughed that the hero would never be able to get out of there, and that Hyunwook should better look forward to his beating, because Wunschel swore to take his time with it, and to tear him to shreds. Imagine Wunschel's absolute shock when that fist came swinging towards him instead and sent him flying across the room. The blue-haired skirt-wearing pervert was shocked beyond compare, and he stared in confusion at the big guy who had hit his attacker. Then his eyes widened when he recognized the person in the hood. It was a familiar fae with elongated fangs and red eyes, but an earnest expression that he knew well. It was Lee Won-suk. 10 minutes before Lee Hyunwook and Lee Won-suk's encounter, the rains came down heavily on the building, and a bloody corpse was dragged along the floor, leaving dark trails. It was one of the many corpses of the students that had already been sacrificed, and they were tossed in a dump with other corpses. The evil zombies then asked their minions to bring forth the next offering candidate. They had to hurry so that they could return to the embrace of mana, and all the other nonsense that their cult believed in. The men laid out the newest girl on the altar, and she was unconscious as those demons began to pray with fervor for eternal life. They prayed silently and twistedly for the key that would guide them to be beside mana. They all prayed rather earnestly to be granted the key that they so desperately desired, and they pleaded in their prayer for eternal life. There was a huge spark of energy and power, and the light fell on the poor unconscious sacrifice. The light grew even brighter, and the girl was lifted high as dark tendrils of red smoke encircled her unconscious being. The sacrifice progressed, and the girl's mouth fell open in a tormented scream, eyes lit up like bulbs. The magic grew even darker as the red further spilt from the sacrifice, and it seemed her energy was passed into the corrupt tree that manifested behind the high demon priest. The demons cheered as her energy was sucked away and the girl fell in death, limp on the sacrifice table. The zombies continued to watch, but there was one imposter among them. Lo and behold, it was a familiar-looking lady with blonde hair. That pink-lipped menace smiled in wicked glee. And the priests celebrated the final offering that they had found. Once they finished the final offering, then they would surely be able to meet the almighty being that they worshipped and praised. The girls' corpses were raised into the air, and the men continued their evil and wickedness, chanting as they offered the newest 3 children, who bore pure mana so that the red flowers may bloom. The children were lifted up, and the cult members cheered with wicked glee. But the hooded figures that were thought to be demons were actually people. Humans celebrate the death of innocent young girls to fulfill their sick and twisted desires. Corrupt, horrible people who relished in the suffering of others. The lilac-haired vampire lady watched all of their cheering and cursed in annoyance, wondering why these people were wasting so much blood. This was exactly why she did not like cults. All they did was waste the precious materials that he held dear to her heart. Then the explosion suddenly went off in the building, and the vampire lady tensed. She had felt the impact just now, even though the Na'vi fools behind her were still cheering blindly. That noise worried her, but the hand of the priest raised to silence the crowd, and all those cheering stopped in surprise. There was a silence that stretched between the worshippers and those who led them for a moment, no one saying a thing. Before the suspicious-looking blonde then licked her lips and grinned at the holy believers of mana. Before the red flowers would bloom, there was one thing that they had to do. Her suspicious request had to be put on hold as we went back to the cause of that noise in the first place. The building smoked because of a hole in the wall, and the hole was followed by Hyunwook escaping with Wunschel hot on his tail. That was when they both ran into Lee Won-suk, though actually, Wunschel had run right into Won-suk's fist. Wunschel had been so sure that he had finally found the chance to beat up and torture the man that he hated. He was sorely disappointed when that man had an ally that neither of them had seen coming. The blonde went flying, and the sergeant looked up at the big guy in awe to find a familiar face. His eyes widened, and realization set in, and his mouth fell open. The last thing that Hyun-wook had expected to see was Lee Won-suk in the enemy base. The man Lee Won-suk then turned to the sergeant, asking him how he had gotten in there in the first place. After all, he had not noticed the cross-dressing man get dragged in and tossed like a sack of potatoes. The cuffs were quickly removed, and finally, Hyun-wook was free, which was a relief because those things had been messing with his aura. The big guy had never imagined that they would meet again like this, though he was really shocked about the hero's weird outfit. The hero was also rather glad to see Won-suk, but he stared at his friend in a painful realization, and asked if his friend was really an accomplice in kidnapping children. Won-suk was horrified to hear the accusation and shook his hands in dismay. He was actually trapped there because of the barrier around the player detention center, and he begged his sergeant to believe him, and that he had not done anything after coming there. Then, the blue-haired guy asked what was wrong with his appearance, and he asked how the big guy had even gotten to the detention center in the first place. It was a really awkward story, and even the big monster could not really remember it. The whole thing had felt like a dream, and when he opened his eyes, he looked just like them. With this appearance, forget other players, he was sure that his own comrades would attack him, so the poor guy had fled, having no choice but to run far away from them. In the end, he had run till he was out of breath, and then he just collapsed out of exhaustion. The big guy stared at the sky with tears welling up in his eyes, having no idea what to do or where to go now. He was in such despair at the fact that he would have to live as a vampire that he just lay there motionless. Some of the passing cult members had noticed him and figured that he was one of the failed subjects, so the two leaders of the Black Magic Association had appeared. He lost consciousness after that, and then he woke up in a strange area. The sergeant was shocked to hear that there were two leaders of the Black Magic Association when there was only supposed to be one. Now, he wondered just who the other person could be. Poor Won-suk begged his sergeant to believe him. He really had not done anything wrong. The blue-haired hero narrowed his eyes in deep thought, and then he turned to the big guy, saying that those children were the most important part. He asked the big guy if he knew what had happened to those children. The man guessed that they were likely on the top floor of the building, since that's where most of the sacrifices were held. Once the blood of 3 children with pure mana was spilt on the altar. It was said that a red flower would bloom. The big guy understood that the children were offerings, but he did not know what they meant by the red flower. That was everything that he had seen and heard so far. He knew nothing else. And he begged again that he had nothing to do with these sinister activities happening here. The sergeant stared at his friend for a moment and assessed the big vampire that he was seeing. The poor guy was already on the verge of tears, which was rather on brand for the burly guy. The sergeant then punched him on the shoulder as he often did in the past, and the big guy flinched as usual. The hero then grinned, saying that, of course, he believed the big guy. Hyun-wook believed in Won-suk, so the big guy didn't have to worry about anything. These words were a huge relief to the big vampire, who immediately started crying in gratitude, though the blue-haired man scolded him for being so ugly. Suddenly, someone banged at the door and asked why the door was locked. They needed it opened immediately, and if it was not opened, then they would just break it down. Then, the sergeant turned to Won-suk, and with his quick thinking, he had some orders that he would like the big guy to carry out. They had to split up and take advantage of the current situation. First, the hero would head to the top floor quickly to stop the sacrifice of any of those innocent children. Then, the big burly guy would head down and figure out a way to turn off the barrier activation device. The AMT was standing by outside as support. He asked Lee Won-suk if he could do it, and the big guy was eager to please. Right before they split up, the sergeant just needed to fix one more thing, and then he was gone, taking off while the big guy prepared to face those trying to break down the door. Eventually, he succeeded, and the door fell apart. About a dozen men appeared outside, all with their player powers activated, and they wore the blue clothes of those who worked for the cultists. The giant vampire greeted them when they entered, and they were confused about why he was suddenly standing, and why he looked like he was going to fight them. The creature would not even give them his name, and now he wanted to get in their way. They did not take too kindly to that. That was fine with the big guy though, and he roared as he faced those jerks before him. Won-suk roared, the force of his scream pushing the men back a bit, so that they had to hunch their posture just to withstand his power. The creature was large and in charge, and he recalled how the sergeant had told him that he had not been reported for desertion yet, so technically, he was still under Sergeant Lee Hyun-wook's command. Just before leaving, his sergeant had told him that if he ran away, he would kill him. Those kind words of love and understanding meant so much to the big vampire. So much so that he would tell those jerks his name. He was the 3rd Anti-Monster Brigade's 1st Battalion, attack platoon's Private Lee Won-suk, and he charged at those bad guys with joy. Meanwhile, our hero went racing up the stairs, hip swinging his skirt as he sashayed his way to justice. The hero had to hurry to save those children before they lost their lives to that wicked cult, and he ran as fast as he could. The man paused for a moment, knowing that he had to approach as carefully as possible. Then he groaned, wondering what was with the nauseating stench of blood coming from the room upstairs. That scent was so strong that there was no way that it was coming from just one or two people, and dread filled him as he got closer and peeked inside the hall to see corpses and corpses of dead cult members. This was the reason that the stench of blood was way too strong and overpowering. Lee Hun-wook stared in horror to see that the Black Magic Association had been massacred. They held the 3 girls captive and suspended in the air, trapped in dark threads of mana, and a familiar blonde glanced back with a red glint in her eye. The blonde asked who would dare to approach the sacred altar. Well, the hero had been spotted, but he took off running anyway, and a large boom rocketed through the building, punching an even bigger hole right through the wall. This new hole was even larger than the first hole that had been created on the side of the building. The hero had to be careful not to fight such a destructive force head-on. That shot had definitely been a killing strike. However, hovering nearby was the suspended body of one of the young girls who used her last strength to ask for salvation. The blonde leader chuckled, saying that our hero was much like a rat, and she licked her lips again, which seemed to be a thing for her, and threw back her hood to reveal herself completely. She yelled and told her enemy to come out and show himself, then maybe she would show mercy and kill him immediately without torturing him. Then the blonde changed her mind, telling the hero just to keep hiding, because then it would be much more fun to play around like that, and she licked her lips again. This deranged blonde was Park Ji-yeon of the Seoul Detention Center, and she was supposed to be its warden. An Mintai was commanded immediately to raise his shield and to move forward. The barrier was still intact, but the soldiers had decided to march out anyway. The leader told all the soldiers to be careful the moment they passed the barrier, since they would not be able to use their powers inside. They had no clue what would happen, so everyone had to keep their guard up. Even though they were in the middle of an assault operation, they were screaming their lungs off and making a mess of things. The wicked guild leader could not help but laugh and call them pathetic. This made the wicked jerk feel very sure that there was no way those guys were the ones to take down the first cause of erosion. Technically, he's right. It wasn't the soldiers, but their cross-dressing leader. However, he could not have done it without them. At any rate, Theold was determined to take them down by striking the rear. The orange warp portal was opened up for the soldiers to pass through, desperate to lend aid to Han-wook. They were focused and exchanged eye contact as this warp portal was opened. As they slipped in, they recalled that their commander had told them to use a deception operation. See, there was no doubt that the not-so-great Mountain Guild was connected to the Black Magic Association. Even so, the reason they or the soldiers could rashly attack the other was because they were a guild and they were a military unit. Those were 2 separate forms of power that were not supposed to interfere with each other. As such, the moment the assault began, the guild was sure to aim for their rear in order to sweep them off their feet and shut them down. If that was the case, the soldiers, for now, would feign weakness to give them an opportunity and to let the guild attack them first. That way, the soldiers would have a definite just cause for taking action against the not-so-great Mountain Guild. The soldiers admitted that it was a pretty creative idea, but there was one fatal flaw in his plan. After all, their big boss was going solo on a rescue operation, and they would not be able to match up to the guild's firepower by themselves. That's when Han-wook grinned and said that his men did not have to worry about that. They just needed to focus on buying time. Then, he turned his attention to the key to the operation, the lieutenant, who was a little caught off guard by this sudden burden. Once again, it was all up to him. It wasn't easy, but all of the men were determined to carry out this plan flawlessly in the name of their supreme sergeant. So, they would not begin the deception operation. The snipers stood at the ready, and the guild members began to close in. Above the attackers that moved in on the sniper flew Kim Se-hee in an overpowering move of playing chess while the guild was playing checkers. The unimpressed Wind Lady glanced down at them, and then she soared, taking down those jerks in one fell swoop as she knocked them right off their feet. In a whoosh she was off, taking them down without letting them make a single sound. She was a light and unstoppable assassin, moving at speeds that their eyes could not keep up with. Se-hee took one hostage, threatening him not to move. She ordered the man to send the signal that the assassination plan had succeeded. The girl pulled down his sleeve to check his watch, and the signal was sent. The guild rejoiced that the sinner's assassination had been complete, and the idiot grinned with satisfaction. The man said it was now time for the strike team to go in. The guild then leapt into action, fighting in a very cowardly and disgusting style of combat. The guild leaped as one, sending so many men to attack the small circle that was huddled around the portal. A very cowardly move, as expected of barbaric rats. The lieutenant then got the message that the sniper team was secured, and the guild closed in on them hard, drawing closer and closer. Then the lieutenant shouted for Minty, and the man raised the shield, opening it to cover the men behind him. Then the soldiers were ordered to fire. It created a protective barrier, Minty at the back as their shield, while the others fired at the guild relentlessly. Albeit a temporary barrier to the guild's large numbers, it was able to buy the soldiers time. The leader of the guild roared in rage, wondering when the enemy had realized that they wanted them dead. Not one to accept defeat, the guild leader yelled for the sorcerer team to get in there. He would not be outdone by a team that he considered to be less than gutter rats. The sorcerers marched out with determined looks on their faces, feeling sure that they could take down the men before them. There were actually too many sorcerers. It was like bringing a gun to a knife fight. All at once, the sorcerers blazed out purple fire and shot it in the direction of the soldiers, intending to burn them alive. Minte kept his shield in place, blocking the fire from making contact with the men behind him, but the flames were intense and strong. They burned hot and seemed to consume the entire team, much to the wicked guild leader's pleasure. The man, whose heart was as ugly as his guild leader's face, laughed that all the AMT members were burned to death in battle by a Black Magic Association player. That was the lie that they were going to happily feed to their superiors. A very nice and clean report. The fire raged hard against the cornered soldiers, but in the middle of the barrage, one of the sorcerers suffered a headshot and suddenly went down. It was a surprisingly shocking occurrence for the sorcerers, but more was to come because the snipers were alive and ready for them. The target was acquired, and the snipers would provide backup from the roof. The guild members were shocked and horrified, wondering where the assassination team had gone and why the snipers were still alive. He yelled for the tanks to block the snipers immediately, and the barrage continued on the soldiers from all sides. However, the soldiers they were aiming for had already warped to another location, shocking the guild leader even more. At this rate, the man might get a heart attack from all the surprising things happening around him. The lieutenant yelled for the soldiers to get into position A and fire ahead. They unleashed gunshots on the tanks, but that was no good. The tanks were built to act as shields after all, and the soldiers only had one shield. Most of the bullets bounced off the tanks, and they were mostly unharmed. The guild leader growled that those jerks had been aiming for them from the very beginning, and he was determined to make those soldiers pay for not trembling at the sight of them and making a fool of their nonsense guild. The guild leader was so heated that he suddenly and loudly declared that he, the leader, would kill them all. Suddenly, a large tornado seemed to manifest out of thin air within the area. Now this development was shocking for the soldiers as the large apparition bubbled and twisted and turned unnaturally heading towards them. It was a conjuration from the guild leader, and he dared them to try planning all they liked in the face of his mighty whirlwind. All of their plans would come to nothing, and they would get swept away and killed. It was indeed a powerful summoning, rather frightening and large in size when compared to the common men. The lieutenant was horrified to see such a terrible thing coming right at them, and wondered just when that hidden card that Hyunwook had told them about would come into play. It looked like they were about to get swept away by the wind. Meanwhile, inside that building, a dude lay beaten up and unconscious. This was, of course, the work of Lee Won-suk, who had been very busy, and he panted for a moment to catch his breath. The big guy then pushed the final button of victory, and he got a caution warning that the barrier surrounding the facility would deactivate. Yeah, that was exactly what the big guy was trying to achieve, and he recalled a memory of his beloved sergeant telling him not to run away, and that he should fight. He was to protect his comrades like a true soldier would, and then his comrades would protect him in return. Once again, the caution warning about the barrier sounded, and the man, now a vampire, called the name of Sergeant Lee Hyunwook. From now on, he would no longer run away. Outside the building, the wind came swooping towards the men, and the leader laughed like a real villain, calling them arrogant fools that he was about to tear apart easily. Suddenly, the rocks that had been flying so fast, raised by the force of that mighty wind, came to a standstill. It was so odd how everything seemed to slow down and stop moving at the same time. Suddenly, a voice called out and asked the man not to get in his way. It was Glasses, and he told the jerk to move. The poor guild leader did not even have the chance to respond before he was absolutely decimated by the impatient man in glasses, and the guild leader yelled in pain, falling over. Much to the horror of the guild and the joy of the soldiers watching, a new player had stepped into the scene, and it was Sergeant Choi Youngjun, the nightmare of that one vampire lady. In a flash, the sergeant had easily swept the guild leader away, and the bespectacled man took off his hat to yell out the name Lee Hyunwook. It was quite a mighty shout, and shocking to all the soldiers who stared at him in surprise. They had to ask Youngjun what was wrong, and the man grinned like a crazy person, asking where Hyunwook had gone. Well, the soldiers were not sure if it was safe to answer that question. but they finally pointed towards the detention building, explaining that their boss was inside. This turned their attention to the building before them, and they watched in awe as the barrier began to go down. The sergeant in question was currently hiding from a demonic blonde lady, and the man with the glasses grinned, asking Lee Han-wook to wait for him because he planned to cut him up alive. We continue from the huge hole that was made in the side of the building as soon as the warden discovered that a stranger was sneaking around inside her building. The blonde laughed that the man hid like a rat, and the little girls begged for salvation as they hung suspended in the air. Then the warden licked her lips and made her threat, telling the rat to show himself quickly so that she could kill him with mercy. However, if he preferred a chase, then she was also more than happy to wickedly oblige. It was so much more fun that way after all. Those were the words of Park Ji-hyun of the Seoul Detention Center. The caution signal went out that the barrier surrounding the facility would now deactivate, and the snipers watched in awe as the barrier began to come down. Finally, they could move ahead with the plan. Kim Se-hee watched the barrier descend at the ready for any commands. The villain arc was the worship of darkness, where the villain had to recruit 500 zealots to worship the darkness. That was complete. Then the warden had also slaughtered the zealots as an offering. It was then time for the warden to bloom the red flower and raise the land. The blonde said that she would take care of this place, so all they needed to do was to go ahead and finish the ritual. She tossed her hood in joy, much to the surprise of the person with her, but Blondie had wanted an excuse to let loose for quite a while now. She had started getting bored with the villain quest, so it was now time that she had some fun after all of that hard labor. Meanwhile, the hero was stunned. According to his knowledge, there should be only one person leading the Black Magic Association, but surprisingly, there were two. Facing two villains at once was too great a risk, even for him. A big purple ball spun above, sucking the life and blood out of 3 student sacrifices and stealing the blood of the zealots below. The core of the erosion continued to thrum with bright brilliance as the evil grew stronger and stronger. Hyun-wook gritted his teeth because he had spotted the core. Really ugly roots had started growing out of it, and they spread all through the room, ugly and thick as they pushed their way into the world to spread corruption and suffering. The figure that remained hooded stayed to oversee the process, while Blondie would leave all that to them. Meanwhile, Young-jun paused when he noticed something odd about the building, and the lieutenant's attention was also pulled towards it. The situation was even worse than they had feared, as they saw a giant tree sprouting suddenly from the top of the building. That gigantic thing was large. It was almost impressive the way it just sat on top of the structure, but it was also very clearly evil and wrong. Once the blood of the 3 children with pure mana was spilt on the altar, a red flower was supposed to bloom. This flower would bloom because the children were offerings. But the worried Won-suk had not understood what the cult had meant by the red flower. Now, Hyun-wook understood why they were using the blood of children with pure mana. The red flower and this tree that grew out of nowhere were scarily connected. The children remained suspended in the air, unable to escape as the hooded figure continued the process. The hero had no idea what these jerks were planning, but he had come to save those girls. Before that red flower thing bloomed, he had to save those children. The man gritted his teeth in annoyance, determined to come out and help those in need, and thus Blondie found him. She was quite excited about it too. She'd been very bored. You see, the hero gritted his teeth in annoyance as he had completely forgotten about her for a hot minute, and she swerved to smash him, bringing her pointy weapon down. Obviously, our guy easily dodged that. He was not about to go down from one hit, even if it was a new enemy. The lady twirled around, unbothered that he had dodged the first attack, and she powered up yet another attack. Now, our guy realized that it probably would have been wiser for him to look for his inventory bag first. The blonde laughed, asking why he was wearing such a perverted outfit. She was going to arrest him for public indecency. Her great shimmering and sparkling weapon came swinging at him, and he immediately activated hardening to stop his skin from getting smashed. The ball of power came closer and closer to his skin, but oddly so did some very strange green hands. Those hands were familiar after all, and one of Se-hee's spirits blocked the mad lady's attack, tanking the explosion. The hero immediately recognized the wind spirit, and this meant that Sergeant Kim Se-hee was on the scene. The sergeant was ready, as she was still a bit sore about losing her last battle, so she was determined to make it up this time. She asked if the hero was all right, hoping that she had not arrived too late, but he assured her that she had arrived just in time. There was one more to fight aside from her. He would go after that person, so he would leave the girl to Se-hee. The blonde licked her lips, and she had the gall to call someone else a pervert with how much her mouth watered. She was glad that a replacement for the pervert had shown up, and the girl's eyes widened in surprise when her spirit was immediately chained down by the warden. A spirit from a lump of mana was a tasty treat for the blonde, it seemed, and she had the poor spirit tied up instantly and devoured it. The poor thing cried out in pain, and the warden commanded her weapon to eat up the spirit completely. See, he roared in rage and charged. There was no way she was going to sit back and watch her friend get eaten. The blonde was expecting that exact approach, and she raised her weapon in preparation. Seeing right through that attack, Han-wook grabbed the girl and told her to dodge. The blast from the weapon hitting the floor was very large, and it caused a great deal of destruction, sending debris flying left and right. Fortunately, the hero had been able to dodge, and the lady was also safe. The hero had to remind the female sergeant to be very careful when fighting this lady. Once she caught her victim, she would immediately absorb their mana, and then release all the mana that she had stored up in an explosive bomb. Sihi was shocked to hear of this, and then Hyunwook reminded her to be careful of both close and long-range attacks. This was going to be a very difficult battle for the female sergeant, but he was still leaving it to her anyway. Meanwhile, he would go and save the children. He told the girl to remember his words from before. There were no predefined matchups or advantages when it came to a battle. They would have to keep looking for a method to win until the end. The lady listened closely to his words, and then said that she understood, so she told that cross-dressing pervert to just hurry up and go. Once again the ladies faced each other, and the very hot warden was quite happy to see her again, asking how much mana spirits had, because she had been torturing that poor spirit for a while, and it was still alive. Blondie was still eating so good and she gasped because it was rather tasty. Kim Si-hee knew better than to lose her cool. The blonde was just trying to bait her. Though that did not stop her from getting filled with so much rage, she asked the Wicked Witch if torturing her friend was fun for her. Well, if that was the case, she was going to summon even more spirits around her. This, of course, instantly excited the blonde, and she gasped at the number of spirits that had come out to greet her. She gasped that it was perfect, and she was just shaking with so much anticipation. The sergeant told the witch not to come crying late once she was done with her, and then she charged. The many wind spirits charged with her, all of them attacking that weapon of hers that fed on mana, all of them feeding it with their power, flooding the pink giant crystal with their energy. The spirits swarmed the eager warden, who grinned like a pervert and babbled about how she was going to suck every last drop of their mana. She told them to come right at her, and they did. A bright and very strong light shone around the midsection of the great tree that had sprouted. The robed figure lifted the knife that they held up high, and laid out one of the girls on the sacrifice table. Now that the tree was ready to flower, the villain was ready to bring down the erosion. The priest was focused as he lifted the knife high, and then he brought it down sharply, intending to pierce the heart of the sleeping girl. However, there was a sudden slice as magical energy went through the priest and his hands shut up in alarm. The priest seemed confused by the spinning small weapon that had appeared before him. The weight of the fragment of Mowgli was then released, and the sword expanded slowly to its original ridiculously large size. The priest was horrified to see a giant weapon manifest out of thin air, and then act as a barrier between a villain and the girl that he was trying to sacrifice. The priest's hood was snatched right off, though it would have been so much more effective to just take his head off with it, and the giant weapon crashed to the ground, scattering debris all through the room. The hero yelled at the horrible villain to stop immediately, as they were not about to let him get away with killing young girls for his sick and twisted desires. It seemed that the hooded figure was the leader of the Black Magic Association. The man did not know what this person was planning, but he told the figure to back away from those children immediately. Well, the figure was a man who had bent his head back to avoid the large sword, and slowly, his head fixed right back in place. The robes around him began to move and writhe, much like they were alive, and his hair swept to his hips. Lee Hunwook was shocked yet again that day as he stared at the villain that he now faced, because the creature he faced now was not a regular player, it was not even human. No, the monster before him was a dark elf, and this villain was dripping with maximum aura. The man gritted his teeth in rage, hating the villains for being so rotten. Dark elves were being that fell into corruption after defying the gods. The hero had heard that there were people who offered treasures to these souls in exchange for strength, but those wicked soulless beings were even selling out children now. It was too despicable. The dark elf stared at the stranger he did not know, speaking a language that Hyunwoo could not understand. However, the hero had already activated the special item called the Crown of Light and Darkness. He did not know what the dark elf was saying, and he did not care, because he was about to beat his ass. Her boss once scolded Sergeant Kim Si for being way too honest. The lady was surprised by such an accusation, and how her honesty was a problem. Hyunwook sighed and said that it was not just her either. This went for most soldier players as well. In the military, players are educated according to their capabilities. That was why they tended to treat textbook rules as the answer to their problems. However, while the textbook did say that one should avoid disadvantageous battles, The man asked what they would do when they could not avoid such a situation. A time like that was sure to come for soldiers. And the lady sergeant looked thoughtful as she considered her response. When a person could not avoid a disadvantageous battle, she wondered what that person would do. Back to the present, Sergeant Kim Si-hee was currently facing a very disadvantageous battle. The Mad Warden laughed, cackling like a mad person as she saw so many wonderful spirits had appeared to greet her. The wicked lady was overjoyed and shook with anticipation, desperate to devour them all. Kim Si-hee charged, telling the lady not to come crying later if things did not work out for her. All the spirits charged along with her, flying at her command towards the enemy that greeted them with joy, raising her huge hammer that sparked to feed on their mana. The blonde declared that she would happily suck up every last drop of mana that the spirits had to offer, and she joyfully called for them to come to her. Then, she released the glowing pink ball at the end of her dangerous weapon, tossing it towards the approaching spirits, who were blown back by the force of her attack. The tree that had reappeared from the rooftop continued to glow meanwhile, and the fight continued as the warden then restrained multiple spirits at once, eager to feast on their power. Then the warden laughed, telling Si-hee that it was such a shame because she wanted to play some more. However, the sergeant was not in front of her as she'd expected, but leaped from above and swung her sword in an arc to kill. Unfortunately, the warden saw her coming and swung her weapon up, much to the horror of the sergeant. A huge blast of mana was released, bathing the room and the sergeant in a huge blast that threw her back. The warden wasted no time in further hurting the spirit beneath her, and she looked up almost cutely to see the sergeant fall to the ground. This was a huge disappointment to the warden, who thought that the fight so far had been very boring. It was only fun fighting someone of similar strength, but this battle was way too lame for her tastes. Here she was looking forward to a grand fight, but her opponent had gone down too easily, and her opponent was also pretty mad about that. The warden then laughed and said that they would play a different game, raising her mana hammer with a wicked grin on her face. She asked the spirits if they enjoyed playing hide and seek, and she lifted her weapon, suddenly activating it, and its glow became brighter. Rocks and debris were lifted from the ground, exposing sea to her sight. Yet more and more rocks were lifted and raised into the air. The sergeant wondered exactly what her crazy opponent was going to do now. But then her eyes widened in horror when she suddenly realized that she was submerged in darkness. The item name was Manhwa, a hero rank weapon, and it could sense all mana within a given radius, restrain a target, inflict pain on them, and then absorb their mana. It could, of course, also release the mana to create a strong shockwave. That was the weapon wielded by the evil warden, and she grinned maliciously, eyes flashing with a deadly light. The lady could easily sense all of the spirit victims that she had captured just lying around the rubble. Blondie had indeed created a twisted game, blocking out the light. She had activated her mana sensors so that she would have the advantage in this battle. Now, only she could find other people by following the light of their mana, while the sergeant was submerged in darkness. In this kind of fight, Si-hee could not hide from her, and the blonde grinned wickedly, asking the lady if she was quite done hiding now. She was coming, and she would give the sergeant no time to prepare. This was frustrating for Kim Si-hee, who had to hold back her breath when she suddenly got sliced in the side by a protruding branch. She covered her mouth to stop her scream, especially when she could see the corpses of all who had died uselessly in that building. The warden searched for her, calling out like she actually expected Si-hee to respond. It did not take long for the blonde to find her, and she cackled in glee, launching at what she thought was Si-hee, but was actually yet another spirit. Blondie sulked about missing her shot, but she was not discouraged. She laughed madly, asking why her opponent was hiding now when the brunette had been so spirited earlier. Perhaps the brunette was now the one who was crying in the dark, and the blonde went silent as she went back to spirit sensing. The brunette quickly realized then that she was at a huge disadvantage in this fight. The blonde was finding each spirit in complete darkness, and she was definitely using some kind of special search skill. Once again, the blonde screamed in victory that she had found her target, but it was yet another spirit that she so casually knocked aside. The blonde laughed that she was still having so much fun and wondered if that was bad. Pink light zoomed as the warden whipped around all through the room, dancing from left to right as she took out spirit after spirit. Even if the brunette just went into hiding, it would not stop the warden, who planned on eating up all the mana that the spirits had to offer. She would happily devour everything, much to Kim Si-hee's horror and alarm. The spirits, her companions, were suffering as the blonde warden continued to target them and cut them down. One by one, slowly but surely, the brunette was losing every advantage in this fight, and the blonde laughed that the sergeant must be going crazy from how powerless she was. Then, she suggested yet another game. The warden asked the sergeant to come out, get on her knees, and then beg for her life. The lady laughed, her eyes glowing pink as she jeered at the brunette, asking her to get in front of her and begged desperately. This further angered Sihi as she hated the desperate situation that she had found herself in, and she especially hated the warden. In the darkness, the sergeant called for her spirits to assemble, and they all came to her at once, lighting up the area like beacons that the warden could follow. They all came into her, their mana returning to home base as she apologized to them, saying that she just could not lose all of them. This method of fighting was to her disadvantage, so it was time for her to change tactics. The blonde laughed and mocked the girl, saying that if she called them back, then she could of course follow all the spirits and find out where all of that mana was concentrating. In other words, the warden had found her target, and the ball above her kept spinning as she activated the restraint, determined to attack and defeat her opponent. Sihi was detected right in front of her, and the girl's eyes widened as the blonde got closer. In her moment of despair, she recalled her sergeant's words on what she should do when she faced an opponent where she had no chance of victory. The man had smiled back then and said that a person would then have to use everything at their disposal to win. The girl had been curious about his words, wondering what he meant by anything and everything. Well, for instance, if she were in a battle and she did not think that she could beat the opponent head on, then it was best to aim for their back and assassinate them in one go. The lady was shocked to be advised on such a despicable way to fight. However, the hero reminded her that there was no sense of fairness in a battle between players. It was stupid to bother with those kinds of things in a life or death battle. There was no reason for them to fight fairly against a criminal who had no regard for people or lives. The hero had patted her shoulder back and reminded the young lady that war was not a sport where everyone was expected to play fair. In real combat, it was meaningless if they did not survive. It was time to forget what textbooks said about fairness, only then would she survive. Back to the present, Blondie launched right at Sergeant Kim Si-hee, determined to do her dirty, and she slammed her mana hammer into her to drain her mana in the most painful way possible. Unfortunately for that little wretch, it was not her real body, and it had in fact been a spirit in disguise. The real sergeant ran quickly, watching her opponent as she waited for the perfect time to strike. The light from the mana attack helped her pinpoint her opponent's location in the darkness, and she used her weapon to stab deep, dark wounds into her opponent from below, shocking the blonde warden, who dropped her weapon in pain. It seemed Blondie could not take what she dished out. With the mana hammer dropped, the spirits fell free, and the warden began to immediately throw an angry hissy fit. She cursed at Sihi, yelling at her for daring to act so cowardly when she was supposed to be a soldier. The sergeant thought that the accusation was a huge joke that was not even funny. The likes of a villain like the blonde did not have the right to say something like that after all the horrible things that she had done. She has covered everything in darkness and sucked out mana from other people like a disgusting mosquito. Even if Sihi was a soldier, there was not a single soldier out in this world who would fight fair against people like her who would kidnap children and sell them out. The blonde yelled in protest and anger. She was really upset that someone dared play her game with her own rules. And she said that she would kill the sergeant with her own two hands. Well, that did not seem likely as she was quickly finished by the sergeant, and Blondie's body fell back, blood bursting forth from her wounds. The spirits were free from their entrapment after enduring hours of torture. It was the worst. The spirits were so happy when their bidding fell off, and Kim Si-hee stood over the body of her fallen opponent. From now on, the lady swore that if she were up against a villain like the blonde, then she would not mind becoming an assassin. Meanwhile, our guy could not believe how rotten those darn villains were. After all, they had dared to sell even children just for their desire to gain power. The dark elf stared at the hero, not even slightly bothered and exuding maximum aura, as he muttered something in a language that Hyunwook could not understand. The man activated metal, bending and growled right back at the elf because he had no idea what the creature was saying. However, none of that really mattered to him because he was still determined to slay the dark creature anyway. The monster pointed its mighty weapon at him, its eyes dark red and threatening, and the hero matched its aura for aura. The little girl's life was on the line, and he refused to mess that up by charging at the elf in his skirt. The dark elf also raised his weapon to greet the hero, and they began their clash. However, just as they began their clash, Youngjun appeared out of nowhere, cursing the name of Lee Hunwook. The sergeant was absolutely pleased to see his bespectacled friend, hoping to fight by his side again, just to get straight up attacked by the angry officer. Glasses looked downright feral as he grinned in victory at finally finding the blue-haired man. Lee Hunwook was both shocked and appalled, trying to tell the sergeant to calm down for a second and listen. However, Youngjun shut him down, calling the hero insane, because if he were not insane, he would not have done Glasses so dirty. Suddenly, Glasses turned and saw the dark elf shamelessly attacking while they were both distracted, and they both had to jump their separate ways, splitting before the mean attack could hit them. It shattered the debris behind them, but the two sergeants were mostly okay. A huge wind blasted the debris from the force of the attack, and yet another hole was blasted in the wall, creating such a beautiful view. The hero was stunned that the monster had the power to blow away a tree that gigantic without even using a mana blast. This handsome elf would not be easy to defeat at all. He was dangerous. Despite the very serious situation, Youngjun refused to get his head in the game and was still somehow trying to attack Heinwook. It was like the sergeant's presence was more curse than blessing. Now the hero was wondering if Glasses was even more dangerous than the darn elf. The bespectacled sergeant yelled that he was doing this in vengeance for his precious children, whom he would not trade for anything in this world, and they were the result of his blood, sweat, and tears after being dragged into this absolute nightmare world. The hero tried to insist that this was not the time to have this kind of fight. Glasses were being exceedingly ridiculous. Meanwhile, Kang Baxil, also known as Snow White and the student and granddaughter of Kang Jongdu, and the one who would make master-grade items in the future, gasped in awe as she was introduced to such a large array of hunted armors. She had never seen such a display before. Her grandfather understood her excitement as these kinds of monsters were usually boss monsters in gates rank B and above, so it was hard to collect a lot of them, and this was remarkable. Kang Jonggo was a master amongst masters who made countless of items until his death, which was in 4 years' time. The happy granddaughter turned to her big sis to ask if they could modify these as they saw fit. The redhead admitted that they could, since they fought those monsters to rescue these two for that purpose. The happy girl gushed, saying that she had thought their rescuer was just some rich guy, but to think that he was also a high-ranked soldier made her gush. The woman then hurried to clarify, but the happy girl was already far one, thinking that if she could smuggle a few arms and legs, she would make so much money. She gasped at the beautiful Orihalkan alloys. It was insane, as there were also magic links between the helms and the swords. The Baxil gushed and showered adoration all over the giant metal suits. Her grandfather warned the girl not to run and fall. He was worried about her after all. Then, the redhead glanced at Choi Youngjun, spitting at the man trying to sneak around, and she asked where he was going. Glasses mumbled that he was just going to take some time to take care of himself after returning from the mission, and that he had a lot to do, and he wanted to weasel out of any more work, but he was speaking so fast that the redhead could not hear a word that he said. The man then spoke up that a combat deployment and civilian rescue, right after he got back from leave, was way too much. He knew that he could not rest as much as he did during the waves, but he needed some time for himself, or at least a drink every once in a while. He did not even have the time to open any of the whiskey that Hyunwook had so kindly given to him. Suddenly, they both got a message. The message was for the platoon leader, and it was from Hyunwook. They had finally gotten a signal, and they requested for the blacksmiths that he had asked for. They were looking at the hunted armors in that moment, and Glasses begged for the platoon leader to tell the hero that he was dead. Everything was working out perfectly for Hyunwook, and he requested that the blacksmiths disable the magic link of some of the armors first. Then, he asked the lady to take those armors and weapons from the armory and come to support them. They also needed to bring Sergeant Choi Youngjun as well. As one can imagine, the sergeant in question was horrified to hear this. The man yelled that he did not want to go. After all his missions, he had been in combat for a month straight. He refused to go. The hero had then grinned wickedly as he recalled coming across Choi Youngjun's private stash of booze. The officers with him were worried that he'd kill them if he found out, though that was the exact kind of passion that Hyunwook was going for. Lifting the communicator to his lips, he mentioned that when they were packing supplies, they just might have accidentally packed up the man's box full of alcohol that he had been babying for the last 2 years. If something happened to them in the mission, then they would not be able to return the box to him. It was such a pitiful situation, and there was nothing they could do unless the sergeant came down to help them. They were holding his precious alcohol bottles hostage, naturally. Glasses would not forgive them. The bespectacled man was in shambles, asking what they were talking about. He screamed for his babies, asking the hero if he wanted to see him go insane. Suddenly, the hero cut off the call and giggled, pretending that they had lost the signal to further trigger the already enraged Youngjun. Well, he got what he wanted, and now Glasses was furious to demonic Cheshire Cat levels. She had dared to smuggle away his precious alcoholic babies, and he would not stand for that kind of behavior. The man asked the hero to speak the truth, yelling that he was sure that the hero had drunk some of it. Hyunwook was exasperated when he retorted that he did not drink, especially during missions. The two bickered back and forth, and Glasses insisted that he had seen the sergeant drinking that one time. It would have been way more hilarious if the dark elf wasn't watching them fight like fools in front of him. The monster was confused at being ignored. They had stopped his ritual for no good reason, and now they were fighting among themselves. Well, if they carried on like that, it was beneficial for him anyway, and a dark, ugly face suddenly opened its eyes. The dark elf activated something dark and deadly, an ugly creature on the furs of his outfit, and he launched it at them in an attack. Youngjun was still busy trying to bite his way through Hyeonwook for daring to steal his precious bottles. The hero desperately yelled out that an attack was coming, right in front of them, and they could not just ignore it. The creature had extended 10 long ropes from its body, and those long extensions went sky high before the two players. Then they suddenly arched downwards, and Glasses groaned like the fight against the dark elf was just an annoying inconvenience. Then he asked the hero if he could fly. It was best that they take care of the beast in front of them and then fight later. The hero admitted that he could not fully control his flight yet. Well, Youngjun tossed him as the extensions came right for the bespectacled sergeant, and the hero wondered what Glasses was planning. The bespectacled sergeant lipped, managing to dodge out of the way of those wicked extensions that tried to grab them and crush them. The extensions were really targeting Glasses for some reason, and he pulled forth his weapons to shoot at the long, red, persistent limbs, finding them so annoying. The extensions danced along with him, and together they weaved and bobbed, each battling to defeat their opponent. Youngjun was doing pretty good at dodging the attacks. Slipping out of the attack zone at the nip of time while debris went flying around him, he managed to land a hit on the red extensions, but it did not seem to be doing much damage, and he was right back to dodging in the next second. Meanwhile, the hero came in from the back while Glasses was distracting the monsters, and he summoned that giant sword of his. Mass from the Mogle fragment had been sealed, and the sword swung in the area. This was at the nick of time because, at some point, the red extensions started picking up in speed. They came zooming at Youngjun faster than he could dodge, and once came so close to piercing his glasses. However, just before it could make contact and skewer him through the face, another mass from the Mogle fragment was released. The giant weapon came down. It was so hard and tough that the strands could not pierce through, and they mostly fell apart. The giant sword embedded itself in the ground, glowing a faint blue. The creature on the dark elf yelled in protest when he could not touch the heroes. He seemed pretty annoyed by the situation too. The hero landed then, gasping that he'd almost died from that shaky and unsteady landing. Glasses was still rather bitter about the bottles, saying it was unfortunate that the hero did not kill himself, though he could always handle that part later. With that conversation, Hunwook understood that it would be completely impossible to communicate with Choi Youngjun for now. The man was really angry. However, the hero's eyes were forever on those little girls. He needed to save them as soon as possible. Suddenly, Glasses seemed to notice the girls and asked if the bug-eyed jerks had done that to her. The hero was surprised by the question. So the brunette said that he was going to mess up those jerks for hurting the kids. This worked perfectly with the hero's plan, and he said that he was sure to mess them up too, but mostly he would be supporting from afar. Then they began to count, much to the confusion of the dark elf and his shoulder pet. They counted from 3 to 2, and together they counted till 1. The monsters were still largely confused when suddenly the two heroes stood, both wielding their mighty weapons that were charged with energy and light. They yelled out charge and rushed at the enemy that they had to defeat, both of them focused on their goal of rescuing the children that they came to save. The monster's eye began to babble in another language as they came closer, unleashing its extended limbs again to kill them. Youngjun met that attack head-on this time, with a glowing blue sword flapping in front of him. Hyeonwook's weapon clashed with the exposed spirit fire, and the hero yelled for his colleague to get that villain. The dark elf and the monster were confused at getting blocked like that, and Glasses swam forward. The red limbs struggled and fought against the giant sword, and amazingly, they were able to charge forward and slice off the dark elf's head in one go. Shiver me timbers, the monster was dead. The danger was cleared as far as Youngjun was concerned, and the hero grinned in demonic victory. However, the beast on the dark elf's shoulder began to laugh. Glasses turned in surprise, sensing something was wrong with the force. The dark elf's head extended to some degree and somehow flew back, rotating and reattaching to the villain's body. Of course, the fight could never be over that quickly. Hyunwook was horrified to see the monster fix right back in place, and the ugly red creature continued its wicked, triumphant laugh of victory. Dark magic bubbled all around the villainous creature in thick and dark purple energy, and as they looked upon the face of this beast and his laughing companion, they were filled with a new sense of dread. So now, they had to think of a way to actually kill that demented beast because they would be darned if they did not get that last laugh. A great demonic purple aura surrounded the dark elf, who stood in the clearing regarding his two opponents, and they regarded him right back as they assessed the situation. The blast of his power was so strong that Glasses had to protect his face temporarily. An enormous amount of mana was being concentrated around the area, and it would be bad if this fight continued to drag on. because he and Youngjun would then be at a huge disadvantage. The monster on his arm had somehow grown even longer, though it was a bit less ugly and now more ridiculous. At any rate, those two were still their enemies, and they needed to go. This time, instead of long red tendrils extending from the dark elf, the weird red thing went itself to kill the heroes. The two then wondered if the man was split into two, and the little red thing was actually his main body. That would make sense with all of the cackling that it was doing. The little red thing continued to jabber and mock in its language, smiling back at the other gray monster that replied in words that neither of the heroes could understand. They could not tell which villain held the main body, and the plan 2 versus 1 was not going to work anymore. Now that the demons had split into two, the creatures kept on mumbling and communicating while the heroes were low-key stressed out. No one knew what the creatures were saying to each other, but they easily guessed that it could not be good. Glasses asked why they were yelling at them, and guessed that they were probably saying something like, "You foolish mortals, you dare oppose me, an immortal," and that they would eat the consequence of death. Well, either way, what the creature was saying did not really matter, because they now knew that its throat could be slit, so that is what they would aim for. Youngjun charged again at the monster, saying that he was willing to see how many times he would have to cut the creature until it died. The monster was also ready, swinging its giant weapon to kill him. Youngjun might not be immortal, but he was no slacker himself. The boy was fast enough to zoom out of the reach of that blow. The smaller monster faced Hyunwook, who eyed it carefully. This laughing, ugly creature before them was not to be taken lightly, and it attacked with its long, pincer-like extensions again. This time Hyunwook had to be the one dodging around, and he groaned in annoyance that the little thing was too fast. The man managed to put up a shield to protect himself and block the attack from hitting home, while Youngjun ran speedily around the big gray cut, actually dicing him up to 100 pieces just like he said he would. The elf split into many pieces, and the grinned, bespectacled sergeant stood triumphant. That fight was not hard at all, and he mumbled that his blood sugar was getting low at this rate. If he did not get some alcohol quickly, he would soon be pretty tired. The man reached into his pocket to grab some alcohol when, before his eyes, the dark elf once again began to stitch itself together. The monster was such a troublesome enemy, and Glasses downed his bottle of alcohol quickly as he did not want to waste a single drop. However, his eyes opened in shock when he felt the dark presence of the monster that he had just cut down, looming over him. The creature pointed its deadly weapon at the surprised sergeant, who just managed to dodge that attack. His helmet and his alcohol bottle got sliced up, and the hero as well got thrown back by his own opponent. This fight was a disaster, and they were both struggling in their own way. The little red thing's power was so destructive that hardening could not keep up. The man kept using up his Mowgli fragments, but things could not continue like this. They needed to do something. The sword waved around, and the hero pushed himself to his feet. He jumped back, dodging the attacks from the red extensions, mostly dodging than attacking because it took all of his focus to keep up. The red thing kept grinning, and it was so ugly. Meanwhile, the handsome man spoke to Youngjun as if he were telling him to just accept defeat. The bespectacled sergeant was quite something for a human, but in the end, he was only human. From now on, they would meet the true wrath of an immortal. Or at least, that is what Glasses figured that they were trying to say anyway. The raging alcoholic laughed that he was translating, so the monster had no reason to suddenly stop talking. Well, the man pushed himself back to his feet, bracing himself for the tipsiness of the booze. However, because of a certain someone, he did not have any more booze to drink. That situation was downright unacceptable. The dark elf stared in confusion, unable to understand just how much Youngjun treasured his drink. It did not matter if the beast he was facing was indeed immortal or not. If anyone messed with his booze, then he would surely seek revenge. Even if the elf did not die, surely it still felt pain. The ugly red thing kept grinning, and it was finally pissing Hyunwook off, and he said that they would soon see just how long that stupid creature would keep smirking, because he was about to wipe that smile right off its face. The man summoned up a sword, and the red thing turned in confusion as the Mowgli fragment was released, and the small sword began to sparkle and spark before the ugly red thing. The thing suddenly grew in size and strength, cutting the ugly laughing beast in half. However, the ugly thing still smiled, its long extensions spread out, attacking Hyunwook full force as it seemed unfazed about the lower part of its robe that got cut off. The hero panted in annoyance, wondering why the creature was laughing again, and why it looked like it had something up its sleeve. The monster's extensions wiggled and wobbled around, and the hero gritted his teeth in anger when he saw the beast sew itself back together. Just as he feared, the tiny red thing would regenerate too. The monster laughed in its full ugly glory, and Youngjun laughed as well since there was no point crying. Both battles raged on between two impossibly strong foes that refused to die, no matter what our heroes did. That sort of battle could be really exhausting. but they did not dare give up for the sake of the kids, and because of the erosion that these monsters would cause. The big dark elf was now starting to gain as well, the more times they failed to kill him, and Hyunwook gritted his teeth in annoyance at their insane mana regeneration. No matter how he looked at it, these creatures were truly immortal. They could not win this battle by brute strength alone, so he began to think. Lee Hyunwook racked his brain, thinking of all the countless battles that he had been in. Monsters would often hide their true selves, so the creature was pretending to be immortal to hide its weakness. If neither the big gray dude nor the small red dude was the main body, then it had to be somewhere else. The heroes thought very long and hard about the opponents they were fighting, the small, ugly red one with a terrifying hat, and the big, handsome, broody one with the muscles. There had to be something that those two were protecting with everything in them. Suddenly, realization hit Hyunwook, and he found their weakness with joy. Injuries to the same body part were not regenerating. So, the problem was not just killing them but killing them together. The battle raged on, and he needed to get this information to Youngjun so that they could put his new plan into motion. The reason why the one-eyed wretch was separated was that they were both real. Those two villains were, in fact, one entity, and they had to be killed together to die. However, the problem now was Sergeant Choi Youngjun. His stamina was lacking, and he had started to rush things. The hero wondered if the man would really listen to him. Well, they needed to end things with one strike, and they had to communicate that immediately. So, the hero yelled out to his colleague about the weakness he had found. If they hit them in the same spot, they could not regenerate. They would not get another chance as their stamina was already going down. They had to strike at their necks together at the same time. Just as the hero feared, Glasses was being a little difficult and wondered where the hero got off giving him orders. He was not letting those jerks have a quick death, and this was the absolute worst part about working with the bespectacled surgeon. They really needed to coordinate this attack. Lee Hyunwook yelled at the other man to get a grip. They did not have time to play around when children's lives were on the line. They had to save those children. The tree had already grown to some degree, and they had to stop the flower from blooming. So many things were more important than his desire for petty revenge. Glasses groaned, muttering that he could stick to the plan, so the hero told him to stop whining so that they could put it in motion. The two villains they faced would obviously not make this easy, so they both needed to lock in. The hero ground as the halo around his head brightened. They would only get one chance, so they needed to concentrate. If the two monsters realized what they were doing, it would become even harder to take them down. Well, the gray-skinned elf pointed its large weapon, and it charged. Meanwhile, Hyunwook activated the metallic transformation guard. Then, spinning like a princess in that skirt of his, the hero made his attack, moving faster than those long extensions to catch the red monster off guard. Then, he shouted that it was time and launched the key part of their plan. Youngjun also locked in and lifted his weapon, charging for the great gray beast. At once, the metal bender pierced the head of the shocked red demon, and the angry alcoholic did the same with the gray monster. Both were beheaded effectively as they roared their protest, but it was far too late for either villain to do anything about it. They beheaded them both at the same time, and a great light spun through the tree that had emerged from the building. The congratulations message popped up, and the heroes were praised once again for eliminating the source or erosion, called the Pastor of Darkness. They would then each receive an offering that they had received from their followers. It would be a random offering. The prize was great and all, but the heroes needed a moment to catch their breath. It had been a really exhausting fight. The rate of erosion had slowed, so now all they had to do was destroy the core. They had stopped the second source of erosion before the boss monster arrived. If they continued to erase the sources like this, then the Sill wave would be the first in human history to be overcome. Lee Hyunwook was still grinning at his victory, completely forgetting that Choi Youngjun still had serious beef with him. He smiled when the other approached, and Glasses asked if they were finished now. The hero went ahead and said that they had managed to get through that, so yeah, they were done, and it was all thanks to the other sergeant. Glasses did not care and asked the blue-haired freak if he was quite done with his insubordination. The brunette was confused, but the bespectacled sergeant was quick to remind him of his alcoholic hostages as he raised his sword high with rage. They had barely recovered from a fight, but Glasses was rearing to go for another one because the hero dared to talk nonsense to him. He wanted his babies back immediately. The brunette cried out for the sergeant to calm down. The booze was safe between the supplies. He did not want to have to fight after a victory. Lee Won-susk even showed up at some point and asked curiously what they were doing since he walked in on the bespectacled sergeant trying to strangle the hero. The brunette immediately asked for some help, and Youngjun also loudly complained about somehow not being able to slice the hero's throat, which was such an inconvenience to him. The hero loudly insisted that he had not lain a single finger on the booze. He swore it. He had only taken one whiff, but he had not disturbed its contents. Suddenly the bespectacled sergeant stopped moving and the hero wondered what that was about. Sergeant Choi slipped right from his shoulders, exhausted from their little back and forth, and sighing that he was so tired. The poor guy had spent too much time moving around, and he glanced towards the unconscious, unharmed girls. As long as they had achieved their objective to protect the kids, that was fine with him. So, after the man got some rest, he would take care of Hyunwook for sure, he promised it. Then Glasses closed his eyes and began to drift off. The hero could not help but smile fondly at the man who dozed off. Yes, Sergeant Choi was the hardest to control, but he was also the most reliable man that he had. Things were going nice and the hero was not starting to see traces of the man from his past life. They had all done some great work and Sergeant Choi's rest was definitely well deserved. For eliminating the Dark Pastor, they would now receive an offering that they had received from their followers. The hero's reward was ancient coin from an underground kingdom. Hyunwook was impressed as he marveled at the coin that had appeared before him, realizing that this was the coin of a gnome, a very beautiful round thing. Gnomes, the creators of the legendary hex deck, their traces had mostly been found through items and objects, because they were an ancient civilization that never appeared in his past life. Due to this, gnome items were astronomically expensive, but also very effective. Lee Hyunwook could get an ancient gnome item with this beautiful coin, so he did not dare eat a metal so wonderful. The man instead harnessed the power of the coin in his hand, clothes and skirts flying as he channeled it. The window then congratulated him for having awarded a devil's medal, called Legion. The man beamed with joy at seeing the pop-up window. Legion had taken quite a while to digest, it felt like months, and he had even received a new skill from absorbing the elite item, and its name was Signal Core. A rank skill that came with transcendent sense and increased mental control. It also came with a Centurion Force, which would increase the maximum number of followers. The hero was shocked to see Centurion Force as this power was great for controlling others and amassing followers. It was a great skill. The hero's ability had no relation with creating followers, yet he had achieved a cheat skill like this. It was amazing. It was not that the hero understood how that jerk from the past had been able to control such a huge army. Just thinking of the necromancer made the boy grit his teeth in rage and annoyance. The current controllable metal had the weight of 5,000 plus grams, and transcendent sense was 30% active. A wide grin stretched across Lee Hyunwook's face, and his eyes narrowed with glee now that he could absorb all of his enemies' abilities now going forward. Lee once it came closer, asking with worry if Sergeant Choi was really alright, and the hero just explained that the alcoholic was known to sleep when he was tired, so Glasses was fine. The man's reward had been Gnome's moonshine, so he held tightly to it in his sleep, mumbling that he would never let go. It was a fitting reward all the same. At any rate, the big guy warned Sergeant Hyunwook that although they had succeeded up here, the battle below was still raging and they should probably go help them. Sounded like solid advice, but the sergeant said there was no need for that as he changed from skirts into pants so that he could fight a bit more comfortably. The big guy was confused by that response, but the hero was right. Below, the soldiers were already busy handling matters, and the lieutenant told everyone to prepare for the warp. The giant orange portal opened up before them, and the soldiers got ready. They held their ground still, fighting off the sorcerers of the guild who refused to back down. The guild attacked relentlessly, shooting blasts at the soldiers, determined to bring them down so that their wicked ways would not be exposed. Providing reinforcements was difficult for the snipers because of the casters, and their location had been exposed. Still, the reinforcements persevered and shot at the guild members. Taeyong was yelled at to get moving, but the man protested that they could not leave their comrades to fight by themselves. The guild leader was so focused on making sure that every soldier just died, and his comrades were concerned, wondering if they could really do this. However, the other guild person insisted that they had to try. Their leader was dead and their mission had failed. There was no way that Chu Kyoyang would let them off the hook unless they actually slaughtered their enemies and the witnesses. They had to take at least some of their heads if they wanted to live. Such was the way of the world that they had chosen to live in. The soldiers were really going through it. They put up a brave fight, but there was only so much that they could realistically do against magic casters. The lieutenant panicked as he watched his men begin to fall, and the casters were gaining ground on them, coming closer and closer, to the point that they were terrifyingly close to the man who held their shield. It was a scary disaster. However, like a miracle, a loud noise hooted and honked in the area, and a car ran right into the main caster that stood at the head, throwing the man away from the small circle that the soldiers had formed. It was a shocking occurrence for both the guild members and the soldiers, and they stared at the car in awe. Out of the vehicle stepped out a healed Shu, and the guild panicked in horror when they saw that Shu was attached to the Dark Paladin of all people. The lieutenant was ecstatic to see Seo Yunha had come for them. Yes, the beautiful redhead Seo Yunha had arrived at the battle, and she stood between the soldiers and the guild members. Violence against the military during times of disaster was ground for summary execution, and she faced the guild, ready to conduct those executions immediately. Lee Won-suk was impressed that even the attack platoon leader had come around. It seemed like everyone was here. The big guy grabbed the unconscious bespectacled sergeant, and Lee Han-suk walked forward, wondering where the blue-haired sergeant was going. Well, the man guessed that blue-haired vampires were likely hiding somewhere in there, and nothing about this felt right. It did not make sense that she did not run over to the next source of erosion, since she seemed hell-bent on showing up at each one. Just as the hero was pondering this, he felt something strong, like a strong presence. And even Lee Won-suk noticed a change in the air. Lee Han-wook turned as well, pulling out his weapon just in time to block the attack of a lady who showed up out of nowhere. The hero had pulled out his weapon just in time to block Kim Si-hee's attack, and he spun around to stop her from gaining leverage on the ground where they fought. The lady sergeant was confused, wondering why her colleague would stop her from taking down the vampire that terrorized them. The man yelled at her to calm down as well, because Lee Won-suk was not their enemy but their friend. Now this was unbelievable information, and the lady wondered just when they started making friends with vampires. She stared deep into the hero's eyes and they seemed to both notice that their faces were very close. She pulled away with a blush, figuring that the tall man had his reasons, so she would not question it anymore. The man thanked her for agreeing with him, promising that he would explain properly at another time. Right now, the Wind Sergeant had done exceptionally well. Thanks to her, the pastors were all dead, and now all they had to do was remove the cores. The second source of erosion was now all over, or so the hero believed. The female sergeant watched her friend with a soft smile on her face, which was when they heard the familiar voice to ruin all of their joy and happiness. Yes, these were the events that led up to that one very unfortunate moment, and the two little girls were instantly killed as sacrifice offerings to the second erosion. The blue-haired vampire hissed that this was not over, and that awful wretch was really determined to see through this madness till the end. They should have done the world a favor and gotten rid of her ages ago, because everyone was absolutely horrified by what she had just done. The monster before them grinned in wicked triumph and laughed, saying that their nightmares were now only just beginning. She had offered a sacrifice to the altar of the sky, and the red flower bud would soon rise at the altar. 2 children had been killed, 2 sacrifices that made an eerie-shaped bubble from the tree above the building. It was indeed a wicked flower bud trying to sprout before their eyes, a terrible omen indeed. The flower's mouth opened, revealing rows and rows of teeth within the petals that summoned forth a large purple circle sparking with deadly lightning. Inside of that portal rose yet another very disgusting and deadly mouth of the beast of the erosion as it prepared to claw through the portal. The guardian of hell, Cerberus, was now enraged at the fissures at the gate of hell, and it was now being summoned, much to the horror of everyone present. Just as anyone would expect, the demonic creature of 3 heads roared and bared its teeth at the second gate, letting out a cry so wild and sharp that it burned the ears of those who heard it. The vampire laughed wickedly and called them all pathetic fools as she approached the last girl. She giggled like a little beast, saying that she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, so she told them to cry tears of blood and watch as her victory came down. Her long nails advanced towards the last girl, the final key to free that monster from the rose, and then they would see their precious Syl burn up in hellfire. A bit too much of this beast's head was out, and it was already preparing to release a fire bomb down below. The creature kept charging up the blast, and the blast grew and grew and grew, sparking in dangerous hues as it set off an intense fire, destroying some of the nearby buildings, setting them on fire. This power, this might, it was all fitting of a beast from the underworld, and the hero cursed that of all the things that could have happened, of course, that wicked witch showed up at a time when their guard was down. This was the worst. That's it for this episode. As always, thanks for your continued support. Until next time.